All right, so thank you for joining us for another edition of our product management book club, and we are reading Product Operations by Melissa Perry and Denise Tills. I'm here with Dr. Michael Crawley, and today we are jumping into Pillar 3, creating a product operating model, process, and practices. So I personally have been very excited for this. I am a huge process nerd, so excited to jump into this today.
Yeah.
All right. So we started off, had a really great story, and I was telling Michael before this call, I really love the story portions because to me, you can read all these books about best practices and think, whenever I try this with my team, I can't get people on board, or there's always this issue. And I love that they're highlighting a lot of the problems that come up. Like, for example, I highlighted this one sentence in the first couple pages where this character named Jill says, there's no time to do it, and honestly, even less appetite from the product managers for a process. Jill said, we've got enough processes. Gosh, don't you hear that a lot? People don't want one more process, even if you're like, this one's going to be great, it'll streamline. It's like people don't want one more thing to follow. So I
Very
wrote
true.
down a note of process fatigue that I love that they're hitting that right away before they start telling us all the great stuff we can do.
Process fatigue. That's a good way to describe it. Yes. And it's true.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. So then, they open up with that, and then we're talking about, how we run ops and what we do with processes. And they identify right away. They say process is a loaded word. I agree, but they're saying, we don't want process just for process's sake. So I like the fact here that they suggest one, going through your processes on a regular basis and deprecating those that aren't useful, because I know I've definitely been in a situation before where I'm following this process and then you sit and think about it for a bit and you're like, we don't really need this anymore. We're just
Right.
doing it because it's in the SOP. Um,
Yeah.
and I think that plays into a lot of the process fatigue is that you have a lot of stuff that's not, you know, essential to function. So
True.
going through, they have they have a note here that says working smarter, not harder. We've seen that in a lot of product management, but I'm glad that they put it here as that being kind of the goal of any process. Like,
Hmm.
we have processes for all sort of things, but in the end, it should be helping us work smarter. Like this should make us more efficient, or it should be addressing a gap or something like that.
Yeah. So, in other words, not just a process for the sake of having a process or to say you have one, but something that's actually going to add some efficiency to the life cycle. And what you said actually about the deprecation, it's a bit of an agile approach too, because in agile, a lot
Hmm.
of times we do these iterations. You have these
Mm-hmm.
things called sprint if you're doing the Scrum version of it. And what happens at those is that you really have a checkpoint. Typically at the sprint, you're getting feedback from various stakeholders and you're letting that stakeholder feedback inform what you may or may not do next. But in this assessing of processes, you can do a very similar thing. When you talk about the deprecation, I realize that's exactly what we do because we look at those at intervals. And
Mm.
then that way you can kind of vet out how much of this is actually adding value. And one of the things that speaks to that, it doesn't get into calling it here, but there's something called value stream management. Have you ever heard of that?
Mm. Yeah, I've heard
Yes.
of that. Hmm.
Yeah. So value stream management typically it does essentially that because you look at your ecosystem and you look at what we call value streams, which is all of the moving parts, and then you kind of look at those that are adding value and those that aren't. And even those
Hmm.
that are necessary that are adding value, you say, well, how long does it take to do this? Right? It's 5 days. Is there a
Mm.
way to cut it down to 3? And so in value stream management, you're doing something very similar. And I realized that's kind of what they're talking about here. They give it a little different name type of
Yeah.
thing. But to go back and revisit and maybe that's a lean concept and basically cut the
Mm.
waste, eliminate the waste is a smart thing to do. So I like that
Yeah.
deprecation.
Yeah, and I like the fact that you were talking about, even if we do have a process in place and it takes 5 days, could we get it down to two? Because I know some things, you start off, it's a very manual version, and maybe there's another tool you could implement in the process to speed that up. But I think a lot of times, once you have a process, you're like, all right, good, checked it off. People know what to do, so you don't think to go in there and revamp it on a regular
Yeah.
basis.
And now that revamping is becoming something of a mindset to really be aware of, because with AI and automation,
Mm,
there's
yeah.
so many things now that efficiencies, I mean, we got to be careful about it because it can insert some inefficiencies there too if we're not careful. But at the same
Hmm.
time, technology just gives us some advantages that we can leverage if we're smart about it.
Yeah, absolutely. So the next section they get into about actually going into, what processes are we identifying? And this is in chapter 12. And they have main components of their operating model. And I thought this was interesting because as the protagonist of our story that we've been following, Ashley, is going through this, she's listing out roles and responsibilities, process for product teams. Um, and I was kind of thinking about, I was like, I don't think I have a list like this, or if I was asked to come up
Right.
with this list, it it seems like kind of a daunting task. Like everything that product management does, because you have roles with so many different departments and teams. I think I would struggle to come up with this list. So this isn't in the text, but I was kind of curious, like, how do you think you would come up with a list like that? Like, I'm not sure where I would start.
Yeah, one of the things too in the product management space, and I do a little bit of stuff in cyber, and because of that thinking, the process is something that's a little tricky. You're right in terms of, where do you come up with starting point? The roles and responsibilities, a lot of times, because of a lot of the project management stuff we do, we have that kind of laid out because there are things like RACI charts, the responsible,
Mm-hmm.
accountable, communicate, inform, and other tools like that that we kind of try to figure out who some of these stakeholders are and what the relationship is to the project anyway. And this is just
Mm,
so that to do project management, sometimes you need to figure out who you might need to engage or probably even distance from certain
yeah.
projects based on, kind of where they fit into that. So the roles and responsibility is something that's a little bit not exactly it's laid out here, but
Hmm.
in project management tools and techniques, it's part of that ecosystem. The processes tend to come a lot of times in some environments when we're doing kind of some lean, some Six Sigma type of
Mm,
things. Six Sigma actually is process optimization
hmm.
technique. And lean, we talked about a moment ago, is too, but there you're looking at eliminating waste. So you don't always have these very tools like some of the ones they're giving us here. And that's
Hmm.
to your point, what makes it tricky is to, okay, well, where do you begin to pull that together? But
Hmm.
again, the idea, and I think they don't mention it here, of value stream mapping, because in the
Mm,
exercise of value stream mapping, you actually are looking to identify like what all of the moving parts is in your flow, that ecosystem flow, whether it be supply chain, whether it be product development or product delivery, and how much
yeah.
value they add. And
Yeah.
so that exercise, I think if we look at something, and there's some techniques for doing value stream management, the only problem with it, it tends to be very technical at times
Mm,
because it's really designed for like supply chains and manufacturing. And when you look at the value stream, the diagrams are very technical and a lot of math and that kind of thing. So it discourages a
mm,
lot of people. But if you can kind of push that to the side and get to the underlying concept of what value stream management is really all about, that's kind of what it's doing, is taking you on an exercise of identifying these value added resources and tools and techniques or components of your
yeah.
ecosystem. And
Yeah.
that helps, like maybe looking at some things about value stream management.
Okay. Yeah, I like that as a starting place for this. I think that would be super helpful. And then something that occurred to me when you were kind of talking through the roles and responsibilities and how they fit into it, that even following what you might call like the life cycle of a product manager, you know, you come in, you get hired, there's a role, there's a job description, there's onboarding, and then there's if you're working with a new product, for example, under processes for product teams, they have templates. Like you're going to need templates to start, you're going to then do discovery. So, yeah, between finding out how do we add value, where is value being created, and what does the life cycle for the people on our team look like? I think you'd probably get all of these. So, Sounds like
Yep.
a
And
good
then
approach.
the roles and stuff too. One thing you made me just think of is some of that stuff might be in HR. I mean, it sounds like we may
Mm-hmm.
have some cross-functional collaboration here to
Yeah.
get all these moving parts, right? So that roles and responsibility, yeah, as we're on board, we're going to have ours, just like you're saying. And if we want to know some of the other stakeholders, then I don't know, HR might be a good place to go for that part of it. The processes, as you say, the project management life cycle, and project managers tend to have a lot of that
Mm.
because a lot of in product management, the tools and techniques that we need are some of the ones that they're identifying here. So you go to that project management team, we might be able to dig some of that up too.
Yeah, and I like the fact that you talked about the cross-functional collaboration because I think that is at the center of why we need the processes is that, for your team with people who are all oriented in the same direction, you can figure a lot of stuff out together without a lot of process in place. But then when you start involving different teams that have different objectives, that speak differently, work differently, I think that's really when you need the processes because people need to figure out how to quickly orient themselves to different teams. Um, and so throughout this section, I was kind of seeing that as yeah.
Yeah, it
Um,
gets reinforced, right, over and over again
mhm,
as we go through and they talk about team processes, even guidelines for working with these other teams or what we call in cross-functional teams. And then you
mhm.
get to the governance.
Yeah,
That's a big. Now that
yeah.
governance one, I don't know. What do you think about that one?
I thought that was really interesting because they break down each of the sections and they do an analysis of, like how well they're doing on each of these. And they said the governance was their big gap. And I was
They
I was
did.
really interested to see that because I think that is also like, for the roles that I've had, governance is often an issue. And they said there's the one section that stuck out to me here is they said the teams repeatedly spent hours reinventing the wheel each time the product team received a data request. And I was like, seen that, experienced that. Oh,
Oops, my
Michael.
thing went off. As they were
Yeah.
saying, it typically is done ad hoc. And
Hmm.
that's what we find, right? Like when we need
Yeah.
something or when there's a request, you're like, okay, let's go and see if we can, figure it out. And having those processes in place, maybe thinking about it up front, which is what they're getting us to do here, uh, kind of gives us the idea that maybe we should put some construct there so that
Yeah.
we kind of.
Yeah. Maybe that would be a good idea. So yeah, that's the big section that they jump into here, the one they focus on. Um, and I like so moving into chapter 13, it seems to me like the guiding question in this first paragraph is are the right people in the room to make the decision in real time, or are your teams just reporting constantly with no action? Because when they started talking about like, yearly planning meeting, like quarterly planning, I immediately thought of a few planning meetings that I've been in where it seems like there's a lot of talking but no action. Everybody says, I'll have to
Yes.
check with so and so, like, that sounds good, but I'll have to see and you don't see a lot come out of it. So it's that stuck out to me. But luckily we've got this section to identify how we get around that. Um
Yeah. Yeah.
so they
One of the
talk
things they note is, right, these OKRs and KPIs. Did you see that?
yes. Yeah. Is that on
Yeah, it
Oh
starts it
yeah.
off on, yeah, it start off. And the reason why that jumped out at me is in a lot of the projects that we've done, frequently I actually tried to start off with encouraging the leadership because OKRs are more of a strategic type of
Hmm.
metric. And many organizations don't identify them. But and then that's when a lot of the kind of confusion comes in because you're trying to figure out, well, where are we, what's the goal here, what are we trying to accomplish, and
Hmm.
how do we know whether or not we're doing it.
Yeah.
So being conscious of OKRs, I'm actually certified in an OKR thing. I actually try to have that conversation come up, and it's very surprising that people don't want to do it. Right. And
Don't
so
want to
that's what
participate
this.
like in OKRs?
Yeah, it
Huh.
because it takes a little bit of work and thinking to come up with these. So you
Hmm.
got to have some conversations. People have to be accountable, and you have to say, okay, let's figure this out. Let's come up with something so we have something to ground us. We have some metrics. We have
Hmm.
a target, and a lot of times, folks don't want to. I don't maybe think about it.
Hmm.
But those are helpful tools, I guess, is what I'm saying, if you can get people to participate.
Yes, and I totally, and I think I can maybe bring some perspective on the hesitant side because I've been in a couple of situations where people wanted to use OKRs, but I don't think we were using them correctly. And so it
Ah,
seemed, yeah, and so I think I love OKRs and KPIs in theory, but
right.
I've seen them kind of poorly implemented. And so I definitely, when I approach it, like I'm a little hesitant. I'm like, a lot of times there's just a goal out there, you don't meet it. What do you do next? And so yeah, you were pointing out in that section here that it says, are you able to change course if your OKRs aren't being fulfilled? And I think that that's one thing that
Right.
we weren't doing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I believe that's what the problem runs with a lot of organizations, because this is a specialized area, and if you don't have like an OKR person
Hmm.
or team, then it does get difficult, and it becomes like those processes you were talking about a moment ago,
Hmm. Yeah.
where yeah, we got them, here they are, we got that box checked off, we're doing it, but how effective is it in making the operation more efficient, or is it
Hmm.
just another thing you're putting out there just because you want to say you check that box off? So yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I like the fact that they say that the real goal for the governance should be having a cadence for vital conversations that enables us to be more responsive to the market and business needs. Because to me, that's like simple, that's concrete, easy measuring stick. And I like that.
Oh yeah, that's absolutely cool. One to illustrate the cadence thing, that's typically with we were talking about agile a moment ago, and you were
Hmm.
mentioning those sprints.
Yeah.
So a cadence, really does is allows people to kind of get into a rhythm. So a sprint a lot of times will be like 2 weeks or whatever the team decides on, but typically people default to like a 2 week sprint. And so
Hmm.
that just gives people, the first, almost like the OKRs you were talking about. When you first start doing it, it's like, I don't know, am I going to have a deliverable in 2 weeks? Here,
Hmm.
the cadence for strategic decisions, you have a checkpoint, you get people in a rhythm, you get people having some type of momentum and some systemization to what they're doing. And it's very uncomfortable in the beginning because, hey, maybe we don't have that deliverable. Maybe we did not
Yeah.
hit that metric per se. But when you're creating a cadence and you're developing basically a rhythm of doing
Hmm.
it, you're almost like training the team to get used
Hmm.
to operating in such a cadence. And that's when it
Hmm.
comes to life. So it's almost like you got to get past the honeymoon phase
Yeah.
and let that thing, a train, it first takes off and it's like, okay, I think this train is going somewhere, maybe not. But when it picks up speed and it gets momentum, you're off to the races. The
Yeah.
cadence.
Yeah. And I definitely think that there's a lot of trust building that happens in the first meetings you set. Because I think I've seen some really well run meetings that everybody walked out saying, when's the next meeting? Like this aligned everybody, this time was well spent. Um, and so I think once you've kind of got that buy-in to the cadence, like you said, you kind of keep that momentum and then you get people involved and it becomes easier to scale up. And like in terms of what this book is talking about in this particular section where um we're looking not only at what are we doing on like in a whole company level and what are we doing on the team level. I just see a lot of potential there from like a team level, building up the trust and support for, your everyday stand-up meetings, your like weekly check-ins and stuff like that, so that like everyone's
Yeah.
excited for like your quarterly business review.
Yeah, absolutely. And they give us a couple here of examples where they're doing it. They have the annual, the company kickoff. And they're like,
Hmm.
when are we doing this? Every year, we're going to have a company kickoff. You've got the quarterly business review. So there's that cadence coming in that we know that company kickoff, we can expect that, whenever, first of every year,
Hmm.
whenever it is. And these other things are going to be quarterly, the cross-functional roadmap review. Um, and so that way, as you say, in the beginning, there may be a little trepidation, what have you, because it's like,
Hmm.
well, really, we're going to be doing this every quarter, or in the case of their roadmap review, they're doing it every month. The team
Hmm.
processes they have there, those are like sprints. So they're doing that every 2 weeks. So yeah, when you're
Yeah.
first implementing these kind of cadence processes, yeah, people do have to definitely get used to it and build a degree of trust that, we're not just having another meeting just because we need to meet again.
Yeah. 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 And it's great this chart on page 115. I love that they say invitees and area of focus. So like two of the most common mistakes with meetings are the wrong people are there, the right people aren't there, and then you don't have clear action items at the end or a clear focus. So
Yeah,
yeah, even though they say this is like a potential cadence, like if you wanted to make sure that you start off on the right foot, you could make changes later. I think this is a really great list to have.
it is. And it's really just to give us the idea of what we're talking about with cadence is that we
Hmm.
want to develop some regularity and some systemized approach to doing these important activities, right? Executing these
Hmm.
important processes. And then to your point, that you've got the right stakeholders in the room and you've got the right area of focus for that particular activity.
Hmm. Yeah, and I some other statement that I pulled out a couple pages after that was okay, so you've got the right idea for the meeting, you've got the right cadence, you got the right people, and then as to actually what happens in the meeting, they say here first we need to tell our stakeholders what the planning process is, second, how they can contribute, and third, when they can contribute. And I love that they hit all three of those things because sometimes people contribute and it's like too early in the process, too late, and you want to make sure you're getting feedback, but you're not shutting down ideas. So I like that they addressed all three of those as far as like what your stakeholders need from you. So,
Those are good thinking points. Ideal.
and they also mention a little bit about prioritization, which I thought was interesting because everyone's kind of got their own ideas around prioritization. You're using story points, using weighted averages. Um, Everyone's got their favorite framework, and they suggest here a combination of weighted scoring average and cost of delay is optimal for both the portfolio and individual product levels. So I thought that was good because a couple times I've come into a case where the engineering team is kind of using their own prioritization framework. The product managers are kind of using their own, and so I think it's nice that they pointed out one that they said should work for both, um, or like a
Yeah.
small product and a large picture.
No, that's awesome. You're absolutely correct because when operating in those silos or those functional areas, however the breakdown might be, um,
Hmm.
just like earlier, they were talking about the tools, right? And we in
Yeah.
chapters previous is that we've got all of these various tools, and one reason why we're doing product operations in the first place is so that we can streamline which of these tools are actually relevant at that operational level. Because each
Hmm.
silo has their own tools, they have their own techniques, they have their own processes, they have their way of doing things. And it works for marketing, for sales, for, accounting. But
Yeah.
now, operationally, how do these things mesh and what really is streamlined and important to create synergy, let's just say,
Hmm.
amongst those cross-functional groups. So to be able to do that, even when it comes to, quantifying, right, whether you're doing weighted shortage first, whatever, uh, kind of puts everybody on the same page, makes the
Yeah.
communication and the relevance of the data, right? The data is more relevant
Yes.
then, right? Because you're
Hmm.
talking apples to apples and
Yeah,
everybody can understand.
absolutely. And they also, one more thing they mentioned in the section that I wanted to highlight is how product operations actually plays a role. Because I was looking at this and I was like, is product ops supposed to run all these meetings? Like, some of these are not necessarily a product ops specialty, right? Like, we shouldn't be
Right,
running the company kickoff. And so
right.
they point out that for product ops, you want to design the cadence. You're kind of organizing the charts that say who's got to be there, who should run it. Um, but then you're kind of taking a back seat. Like, you're helping get people in the right position, um, getting them in the best place to be the most successful, making sure that, the action items are getting to the right people, getting into the right tools, and that the results are transparent enough that everyone's aware. But you're kind of like you know moving behind the scenes is the what do they call it, stage text, like on a show where
Yes.
you're moving the
Yes.
scenery, you're setting things up, but you're kind of letting the play happen in front of you. So,
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And it's very in Agile. A lot of the key roles, some of the key roles in Agile are your Scrum Master, who is tasked with ensuring that the process is running correctly, that you're doing Scrum the way Scrum should be done. And the Scrum Master knows that. That's why they're the Scrum Master. And when it comes to the product, it's the product owner. So other
mhm,
people on the team can execute or build or write code or do whatever it is they're doing, but it's the product owner that's kind of the bridge between the customer and what their expectations are and the product being coming together, managing that team and making sure
mhm,
it aligns with expectation. But similar to the analogy you gave, the product owner is going to kind of facilitate that. They're not going
mm,
to get in there and actually build the product or write the code or any of these other little task level things that we're talking about that can be confusing at times. Or what is the role of operations in the point of our discussion? They're like, the stage, manager. They're like the scrum master when it comes to, are we doing scrum correctly? Okay, you guys are going to do it. You're going to facilitate the meetings. You're
mhm,
going to, get in
yeah,
there and make sure these ceremonies are being taken care of these events. Product owner, you're going to make sure you guys execute and build this product and you do all of the things that need to be done. But I'm going to make sure that we're doing, we're kind of pointing in the right direction, right? Here's the template.
yes.
Here's the cadence. Here's the that. You guys go for it. Do what you do.
Yeah. I like how you said pointing in the right direction. That kind of makes me think about navigating a ship where like, maybe operations is helping pointing the ship, we're not the engines and stuff like that. Um,
Right.
we're not providing the steam power, but we're just making sure that everybody's going the right way. So,
Right. That's right. That's a good analogy.
yeah. So after we talk about that, we get a little bit more into defining process. And I think here we're really talking about templates and, how are we processing things like requests. And I thought this was really interesting because to me, this is always kind of a point of contention. Everyone's got an idea for which process is the best, what template is the best. But I
Oh,
like the fact that,
yes.
yeah, they point out one thing here is that a lot of um, kind of places where you can get stuck. Like they said, with requests coming in, a lot of times people want to suggest solutions instead of the problem. And like, product manager, red flag right there, the whole jumping to a solution before you've got the problem.
Yes.
And so they're
Yes.
saying in a successful template, you want to be sure that people are communicating the why, they're communicating the problem. Um, they're giving us the raw materials that the product managers can do something with. And so I thought that was interesting. This isn't just a matter of which one's a better template, something like Typeform or something like Google Forms. Um, but like what is the form itself? What is the input? What is the output? Where is it going? Um, and even they talk about like the communication process. Like when someone submits a form, make sure they know, you'll have a response in 2 weeks, or this is where it's going next, so that people don't feel like they're just chucking their ideas into a black hole. Um, so kind of seeing the before and the after of the process is good. I'm glad that they explain that as part of the life
That
cycle.
is that is a brilliant call out there, because you are so right, and particularly when we get such good information and guidance, like there are all these tools and all these techniques, but if you're right, if there's not the driver, right, if we're
Hmm.
not really understanding, for example, to your point, the problem we're solving and we're immediately just jumping to a solution to what, right? Is it, are
Hmm.
we, do we have a solution to what we're really here to accomplish or what really needs to be done? Well, great solution, but what's the relevance to it? And
Hmm.
that why almost reminds me of that Simon Sinek book, right? He talks about
Yeah, yeah,
know
yeah,
your why.
yeah. Love
Very
that one.
important.
Yeah. I haven't read that one in a while. I should reread that. Yeah, so they talk about forms and then they get into road mapping. And I was like, oh, and they even noted at the top everyone's favorite debate. Um, and what level should the roadmap be at? What kind of tool do you want to use? And I like the fact here that they talk about, we're not looking for they call it the Lord of the Rings, like, one ring to rule
Lord
them
of the
all, one
Rings.
roadmap. Yeah. Um, there isn't one roadmap. You need different roadmaps and you need them at different levels of detail. So, we might have a really high fidelity roadmap for detailed products that we're working on smaller features. But as far as like sales goes, we need something that's a lot less granular, a lot more big picture, easier to understand. And for leadership as well, right? We need to communicate the larger swaths of things without saying, these devs are working on this part of the feature on Tuesday.
Yeah, I like the way that you call out every step of the way. You're able to kind of call out those granularities and those
Mhm.
details because, particularly, and using this as the example, you're right. Most organizations, when you're doing product, there's like, this is the roadmap, the Lord of the Rings, right?
Yeah.
And really, I don't think people think about there's different lens views to this. And
hmm
leadership is wanting to look at it from a particular perspective versus, sales versus product development or whoever else. So that's amazing that they've done it here, to kind of call out to say, well, there's not a one size fits all. Similar to what we were talking about once again with the processes and the tools for those various functional areas versus the operational area. Don't throw
Yeah.
your tools away, sales or product development team or anybody else. Don't throw your world maps away. But in the scheme of things, there's not a one size fits all possibly here, right? It depends on who
hmm
the stakeholders are and what lens view they want to analyze this from.
Yeah. And then, so on page 25, there are three specific ideas on here that I thought were brilliant. So I want to call those out. Uh, so the first one is they said every item on the roadmap should be tied back to the rationale of why we are doing it and how it will further the business. I think that is super important because stuff ends up on the roadmap and sometimes it gets lost for why do we need this? Who requested it? What is it tied to? And I think that's a major component to, stuff getting worked on that maybe isn't so relevant anymore, but people can't remember why it's there. So having that, I think, is key. And then she talks about creating the templates for how to write each strategic intent, initiative, and option. So, we need to have the why on every item on the roadmap, but in order to do that, we need to teach people how to write that effectively. And I think
Mm.
that is key because I can't say how many times I've seen like a new feature request and I'm reading through the form and I'm trying to figure out what they want because there's like 50 boxes, 50 explanations, and my feature request might not be applicable to all of them, and I'm trying to figure, what do they really want? Um, and I personally like didn't think about it until I read this section, but I was like, wow, a training would have been great if we could have gotten together with the product team and they could have said, this is what we're looking for, this is what we're trying to get out of this form. And us as people filling it out be like, oh, gotcha, that's the intent. I can I can kind of adjust my form to fit that. So
As usual, you're just so keen at pointing out these little subtleties. It's kind of like a gift that you have or something. But so right, because a lot of times, and they are just pointing this out over and over again in different areas. They pointed it out in processes, they pointed it out in tools and so forth. A lot of times I think that, when we're doing product management, there are these best practices.
Mhm.
And in these best practices, it's like, oh, we need one of these. Okay, well, what should be in this, this form? And so, hey, here's some, from some template somewhere. Here are the
Yeah,
20 fields. We've got the form. Bam, there it is. So we can say that we're using this tool.
yeah,
Like we have
guilty,
the
done
tool.
that. Yeah.
And to your point, to give it context and to allow it to have the power and the value in context of what we may want it for, it does help out. Is they're kind of making us aware of right now that why.
hmm
Because we may not need all 50 of those boxes, right? Right? We might
Yeah,
only need 10 of them right now.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
and
that's awesome.
yeah, knowing which. Yeah, and then the other part here that I really liked is the the kind of standoff between product and sales. There's that age-old story, like product saying, "Oh, sales is selling the feature before we had it finished," and sales is like, the product isn't ready when they told us it would be ready. And the first important note I had here was that the person said, after product told them, sales is always overselling us. It said she asked them for an example of when they had oversold the roadmap recently and went to go find the salesperson responsible to get their side of the story. And I was like, boom, right there, you know, something that most organizations don't do, or like, on a personal level, we
Yeah.
might forget to do, getting both sides of the story first,
Right.
figuring it out.
Right.
Um, and then, reading through this part of section and getting to the end and finding out that the sales couldn't tell the status of the different features and clickable prototypes to them looked done. So like, wow, that's definitely solvable, but we wouldn't have known it if we had stuck with just the, kind of he said, she said scenario. Um,
Point
and I
taken. Yeah.
love, yeah, and I love this diagram that they have where they have the stages of a product that we might be familiar with, like discovery, alpha, beta, and then, launch product, which they call generally available. And they tag the sections with when sales can discuss it. And I was like, that's brilliant because now you're connecting the language that the product team is using to what sales can actually do with it. So that's helpful to sales. They finally are like, okay, this means something to us, and product knows how to communicate it with what they're already using. So,
Awesome.
yeah, I was like, nice. Like I've never actually seen a model like this before, and I really like it. Would definitely use it.
Yeah, I'm going to borrow this one as well. Excellent. Good call out.
Yeah. And then the rest of this section, they talk a lot about different toolkits, which I think is interesting because I hadn't really heard of toolkits being described in this way. Like usually when I think of a toolkit, I think of um, a collection of tools like whiteboarding tools like Miro, and then maybe like Jira, some road mapping tools like Product Board, and then maybe some like frameworks that you're familiar with, Moscow or ARR or something like that. But they're talking about like templates and as well as like software and different ways to document things. Um, and I really like the fact that we're going at this not from like here's a bunch of tools in your toolbox, but more like here's some different like scenarios almost that you would find yourself in and the correct way to do it. Because that's much more applicable, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, they pointing things out such as, we know about the software experiment findings and the documentation and the results and so forth from that, the personas. I mean,
Hmm.
A/B testing. I mean, we know that's something you use, but it's not necessarily, the Jira software that we need to be using in product management, right? If we're doing agile, you're like, we need Jira
Yeah.
or a Microsoft project or Excel, whatever you happen to be using. So those things are very obvious. But some of these others, yeah, I don't necessarily know if I would have thought of them as being tools and templates, strategy toolkits, strategy memos, right? Really?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
By the way, yeah, that is true, right? That is a tool, isn't it?
Yeah. And it's so smart because I think that's everyone thinks of the tools that you need to learn and like, this is how you submit a ticket or this is how you move something in the roadmap. But all of these things are really important too. And I have been guilty of, and I think the victim of the, we just throw everything in a folder in Google Drive. And like maybe it's in the general folder, but it's like they're taking the time to say, like, for example, the personas, we're going to keep them on the wiki. We're going to make sure that marketing has access, product has access, sales has access. And when you fill out a persona, like this is the way you're going to do it, and this is where you're going to store it. And maybe this one struck a chord because at one point I was trying to like chase down personas, and someone was like, "Oh yeah, like marketing did one of those a while ago. I don't know where it is." So yeah, I think they this might have been in the section about data, but like the idea of streamlining data and putting it in the right places.
Yeah, putting in the right, and it probably was because again, when they talked about the data, they talked about the tools and all of that. Marketing did it. Great. Marketing has it for number one, their context. That's another
Hmm.
thing. The context that marketing may want to apply it may be
Hmm.
slightly different than, what your purposes are at that time, but you could still use that data, right? You might need to tweak it or inform it a little bit based on what your really what your why is after
Hmm.
that why.
Yeah.
And then, of course, as you say, these things just remaining in their silo and maybe getting lost in a black hole somewhere. It's like, where is this stuff? What's
Yeah.
going on?
And then kind of finishing off this section, they talk about onboarding and training. So, we've created all of these different processes. How do we teach this to people who are new to our organization? And how does that kind of inform how the people on our team learn about this? And I really like the note they had here about a community of practice, which I've been lucky enough to see at some of my companies, but
Yes.
would definitely love to see this more. Like lunch and learns, huge fan of lunch and learns. Um, and just like, it sounds like a lot of professional development. I like the idea of the how did you do that demos from colleagues. We used to do that at Coding Dojo and stuff like that. So uh, I I would have thought of that as more of like a cultural aspect, but I like the fact that they put it in processes. So, you know,
Hmm. Yeah, that is a good interesting place to put it. And it's akin to, have you ever been in an environment where they've done Center of Excellence? They're very similar in a way.
mm-mm. No, I
COE.
haven't.
Yeah, it's a similar concept. And the community of practice tends to be a little bit more of a, okay, well, let's kind of see what best practices are. And Center of Excellence is stepping the thought process up a little to say, well, here's how you really are best in class. I mean, I can think that word's
Mm,
played out now, but it's just kind of the next step up. But either way, what it
gotcha.
does is creates this community of kind of stakeholders and information exchange and vetting things out to make sure that you're really doing things in the optimal way for that community. And again, giving it context, which is what we've been talking about over and over again here. But yeah, to throw into that under toolkits, I hadn't, or tools and templates, I hadn't necessarily looked at it that way. So it's really cool the way that they kind of take this product toolkit and templates and package under that things that some of this we've heard about, right? But
Yeah,
had not really looked at it in that way.
yeah, 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 I like it. And then kind of bouncing off your idea of, the right tool in the right place, they finish off the section talking about the fact that, you know, sometimes we're too dependent on tools to solve all the problems. And the idea that kind of a tool that's being poorly used, even if it's a good tool, might end up being a bad tool. Um,
Yep.
so I think kind of like you just pointed out, context is super important, and figuring out, exactly what all these tools are doing for you is important. So they give a really nice diagram here of a tool tech stack and what you would use each for, which personally I think is really nice because I've heard of a lot of these. I've used a handful of them, but a lot of them seem to be in that same kind of job. But I know there are little differences, but it's sometimes hard to see. So it's super nice to have it here and just like broken down.
That is really cool that they've done that. So, Tableau, we know that's visualization, visually drive, but then the way they've got their stack, and of course there's some that aren't here that we might say, oh yeah, that fits under the product engagement category. But we
Hmm.
really can get to see how these things lace together and interface and, where we might use them in our
Yeah.
ecosystem. And people wrestle with that. So that's very helpful. I do like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of wants to give you like a test environment, test some of this out. Uh,
Yeah.
which I guess in a
No,
kind of way we're okay.
yeah, no, I was going to say, and in the process to know what you're doing with, like, why you're doing this, right? What are you supposed to be
Yeah.
testing this for? And what way are you applying this?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, and I know we're kind of running short on time since we talked about a lot of things in here, but they did finish up with a case study. Pretty big team. They talk about 15 product operations managers, 65 PMs, 250 engineers, and 15 designers. And then they kind of break it down month by month, showing what they were working on, how they defined their strategy, how they built out the cadence. Really interesting to read through and see a lot of these ideas at play and kind of how they got the buy-in, um, and also some things that they think that they would do better. So even an organization like I think it's called Oscar, which is well on that process of being, you know, pretty good with processes. Um, they've still got areas that they want to improve in. So I just thought that was really interesting read, tied in a lot of the ideas from the chapter. Um, so yeah, did you have any specific call outs on
No,
this one?
that I think that's cool. Did you have a chance to really look at this anatomy of planning diagram? It's on page 140 in that same case study. It's pretty
Yeah,
cool.
yeah. I thought it was interesting the local initiatives versus global initiatives.
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure out, is it mostly like an idea of a top down versus like bottom up type initiatives, or is it just like the level at which they're worked on? I couldn't quite tell.
Yeah, so what these guys are in this they're starting with the vision, and they always say that the vision is what drives everything. And so
Hmm.
as we come down here from that vision, which is done, they even have cadence built in here. So with that vision, you do it one time. Although sometimes the vision gets revisited, but it's not something you're
Mm.
going to revisit like every week, right? Maybe
Yeah. Hmm.
once in a blue moon if the company changes direction. But
Hmm.
based on that vision, the strategy is charted. Why? So that you can realize the vision. And that's done every few years. You don't need to go back and adjust a company's long-term strategy again, unless the company shifts directions or there's a merger and acquisition or something to that effect. And then what they're calling short term though is every year, right? I mean, I don't know, short is relative, but in business terms, 1 year's kind of the short term, three up to
Hmm.
3 years is kind of that intermediate, and the longer term tends to go out from that. But
Hmm.
those short term goals are going to everything's going to realize that vision, but it springs from the vision. So we're looking to try to ensure that we execute this thing. So the long term strategy is going to be the big picture. Short term is how do we every year kind of look at this thing to make sure that we're on track.
Hmm.
And there are some local and global initiatives that are going to, I mean, depending on what type of organization you are, some organizations may not have a global presence, although in this day of the internet and technology, it's hard to see why that would not be the case. Because once you're online, like sky is the limit, right?
Hmm.
But there should be some initiatives to realize both local and global um, visionary, and those are visited at a cadence of annually, right?
Hmm.
Are we on track? Everything tying back to that company vision still. And then this is what we were talking about a moment ago when we said, well, what are those OKRs?
Hmm.
And this gets tricky because you really have to, I mean, this is a proficiency because OKRs like processes and tools that we talked about earlier are those things that you might realize that, yay, somebody said we should be doing this. And then you go and you try to do it, try to use that tool, you use that process, and because somebody says that's what you do when you do product management.
Hmm.
But if this is not really done to, like an art and a science, it becomes more discouraging than ever, and you either just throw it out,
Yeah.
right, or don't do it at all, or ignore it, whatever the case may be. But what's
Yeah.
supposed to happen is it allows us to discern if we're actually realizing, are we going to realize our vision ultimately
Hmm.
by making sure that our local and global initiatives that we, in this case, are actually delivering?
Hmm.
Are we delivering on this? How do we know? I
Yeah.
mean, we say we're going to do these things. Well, in one sense, if we say we're going to deliver food to the hungry, that's pretty obvious whether or not we got the food out there, except with an OKR, we might say we want to feed, 1,000 people.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
now we quantify it, and that we know
Mm.
that we didn't just send food out, which is one thing, but we fed 1,000 people. That's
Yeah.
something very specific. And so that's where the OKRs come in. And it really is an art and a science to make sure that those OKRs, because they should be inspiring versus,
Hmm.
discouraging, which they typically wind up being because they're tricky, right? Coming
Yeah.
up with these
Hmm.
things so that it motivates people, but then it's the same time that people say, it's doable. right? And it's
Hmm.
not something that's going to make it look like we're failing at our job, because that's the other side of this coin, right? If you don't hit that number, it's like,
Yeah, yeah.
are you guys doing your, how come we didn't do this, right? It can be used as a tool against you. But then the roadmap is like, how are we actually going to do it? And what we learned about earlier is that we may have various versions of this roadmap depending on whose lens view it is. Is it the
Hmm.
executive level? Is it engineering or what have you? But that's at a cadence of going quarterly. And then
Hmm.
finally, the resource plans. That's interesting that we're doing resource plans quarterly too, or even maybe annually. Annually sounds like a long time before we take a look at that. But all of that comes together to paint this picture of overall planning and
Hmm.
its different breakdowns in this whole anatomy illustration. It's pretty interesting the way they do it. Some may not have
Yeah.
global initiatives, but I think most will. In this case, they do in their examples. So that's why they call it out here.
Yeah. And you're right. I really do like it's a very simple diagram for how much information it has crammed in it.
Yeah.
So thanks for walking through that. That was great.
A lot of it, a lot of information crammed in. And you're right. They just got a few lines and boxes there, and they're like, here, but there's a lot in
Yeah.
here. We're just going to keep it like that. Yeah. Really
Magic of
cool.
visuals, yeah. Um,
Yeah.
and so this section wraps up with a few ways to get started. And I think the key ideas in all of these three suggestions are seeing where you are, which is one thing that I like that this book really stresses is get a map of what your current processes are, what do your meetings look like, what operating model do you have, where's your feedback coming from, where's it going? And they're saying start out here and then you can put some of the other practices in this section into practice. So I think it's a good wrap up of process, when to use process, the different components of it that you might not necessarily think would be part of that, and yeah, how to scale that, how to make it work with, like you said, everything from your monthly, biweekly planning all the way up to annual and your long term vision. So yeah, really like this section.
Yeah, it's cool. And that number three I thought was interesting because they're talking about mapping out. Now we know we need feedback, but they're
Hmm.
talking about bi-directional feedback. I'm not sure
Hmm.
how often that happens. So in other words, it goes both ways.
Hmm.
Have you seen
Yeah.
that? Is your experience been that feedback is typically bi-directional? Is that encouraged in many of the projects that you worked on?
Not especially when we're talking about users. No, like feedback is usually, like you said, a kind of one directional funnel. So I tend to think of the product as kind of being the other side of the feedback, right? Like you get feedback, you update the product, you send it back out again. But yeah, I do like the idea of more of a focus on the bidirectional feedback.
And that's what they're focusing here because they're saying both product and sales.
Hmm.
Because yeah, I mean a lot of things are sales driven, and so
Hmm.
we know we need to sell. But hey, how is this product? Are you satisfied, or do we need to make any adjustments, any changes, new and improved? And so they're recommending in this number three that bidirectional feedback definitely happen, particularly as you just pointed out, product, right?
Hmm.
We miss that side sometimes, product and sales, and that it happens, pretty regularly, and that we make the adjustments based on that feedback, prioritize
Yeah,
and adjust accordingly.
yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
this did summarize very well. I agree.
Awesome. So that wraps up our third pillar. And next time we'll get into part five, introducing product operations at your organization. So very interested to see how they approach this because I know a lot of people don't really have an understanding of product ops or why it's valuable. They've spent, the first a little more than half of the book convincing us why it is and how you would do it. So interested to see how they plan on helping us get other people's buy-in.
That is a biggie because we can have all the greatest ideas and plans in the world, and if people aren't understanding it or seeing how it's going to benefit them, uh, it may never happen, right? So yeah, that is going to be interesting. I look forward to that.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
Look forward to it. See you then.